sort of collapsed, and there was no longer any progress, whereas at the same time there were all these big attacks we all know about from NotPetya and WannaCry and others. And so there were various initiatives from the Tech Accord, from the Charter of Trust around Siemens, from many private actors saying, we need to do something. It cannot remain the Far West. We need to do something. And so many of them sort of banded together around the Paris Peace Forum in 2018. And that's how we got to that initiative, the Paris Call on Trust and Security and Cyberspace, with a lot of contributions from the private sector, from the industry, from Microsoft, from Siemens, and many, many others. So November 12, so almost 2 years from now, November 12, 2018, and the 9 principles that we all know, including the ban on hackback. So I do not know, I'm not a technician, I do not know what constitutes good hackback and bad hackback, so to speak, or at least the measures that can actively prevent cyber attacks, cyber espionage, etc. That I will leave for the panel. What I can say is, of course, it is critical that we go further in working around the Paris Call on Trust and Security in Cyberspace. Just 2 days ago, on November 13, 3 days ago, we had on the 3rd edition of the Paris Peace Forum, Brad Smith from Microsoft, Jean-Yves Le Drian, along with people from the UN, along with Ambassador Patriota and Ambassador Lauber, discussing, and also Marietje Schaake from the Cyber Peace Institute, discussing how we take it to the next step. That is to say, how do we take these 9 principles and the community of many actors, more than 1,100 actors, that's huge multi-actor platform. How do we take it to the next step? That is to say, trying to work to sort of deepen and elaborate on each of the 9 principles, but also how do we sort of narrow the differences between this huge multi-actor platform, the Paris Call, which sort of has its life at the Paris Peace Forum among other places, on the one hand, and the UN process. Because on the UN side, things have restarted, but they're difficult. They're really difficult. And so the discussion was, how do we get that convergence between the formal multilateral process, which is key and which we support 100%, and on the other hand, what can the Paris Call bring to that? And I think, and I'll finish with that, that one thing that the Paris Call community can bring, and that session at IGF can bring, is precisely to go into the details of these 9 principles. And if we manage to, I would say almost to write some norm, if you'd like, or at least to elaborate some more precise definition of what we mean by hackback and what we mean by lifelong cycle of products for which we must maintain safety, etc. This will only add to the work that is being done, not just at the Paris Call, but also at the UN, because one day or the other, we will need these definitions. We will need to see what we mean exactly by hacking back, etc. So this session is really important. It is, well placed in the continuity of the Paris Peace Forum, the IGF, and the UN. And I'm really glad that it's happening, and I will be all ears from now.
Fantastic, Justin. Thanks for that. So welcome, everybody. I see we have group trickling in. This is an interesting topic for us, I think, for industry, particularly at this point in time, not just because it's something that's impactful or complex or much argued over, but also because it's this constant recurring theme. Private sector has tremendous capability. Private sector is on the firing line, owns the infrastructure, builds the infrastructure. Why aren't they allowed to roam as freely as possible to defend the infrastructure? And so one of the things we want to get into today is trying to unpack a little bit this concept that's seen a lot of discussion, but has stagnated a little bit in the last 2 to 3 years conceptually and legally. So first, let me introduce our fantastic group of panelists. Seth Cutler, who is the Chief Information Security Officer with NetApp, Kaya Siglich, who's the Senior Director of Digital Diplomacy with Microsoft, Ed Cabrera, the Chief Cybersecurity Officer with Trend Micro, and the incomparable Alyssa Starzak, Head of Public Policy with Cloudflare. Briefly, I'm Trey Herr. I run the cyber policy program at the Atlantic Council. So what we're going to do today is have a moderated conversation amongst our luminaries here, and then we're going to go to questions from the group. So please let me encourage all those who are listening to ask questions in the Q&A section throughout, and then we'll turn to them in the second half of our discussion. So to get us going, to the group as a whole, I know we're waiting on Ed, but we're gonna fall in line here. I want to ask for everybody that's here, we have among the principles in the Paris Call this notion of a prohibition on private hackback. What does that term mean in your view? Why don't we start with Alyssa, then Seth, and Kaya.
So I think it's actually a really interesting question, because I think we have to think about what we're trying to do, and then think about what the limits are in that context. So there actually is a pretty understandable definition, which is basically a hackback is an attempt to go back in and take data, either take data back or do some sort of damage that will prevent it from going forward. I think the question though is really about the limits on private action to address a cyber threat. So I think we often think about things in the defensive category, and those are obviously not what's of concern. The question is really about potentially trying to get the information. So someone attacks you, what do you do in response? Is there's something that is external to your own borders in response? And to the extent that you're doing it, is it actually an aggressive act? Is sort of the way I would think about it. But we actually do have some definitions in that space, and I think some of our conversation today will be thinking through exactly what they mean for companies like ours.
So I think the key principles that have been outlined in the Paris Call are foundational, but there's a lot of gray and blurred lines along the way. I immediately think about offensive actions by non-government entities taken in response as a retaliation, right? So at the highest levels, this includes unauthorized access to protected assets. It's comprised of deleting or retrieving data, and then intent is the key here. If the intent is to cause harm, that's the problematic area. But there's a lot of gray along that way, right? So Alyssa talked about some of the active defenses, and I think we'll see a lot more of that morph over time. And I think that's part of the gray area that needs to be defined.
Kai, what about you? Microsoft occupies a slightly different position in this ecosystem. I wonder if your thought on this takes us in a different direction.
No, I don't think it does. So yeah, I know, I think we do occupy a slightly different position, and I think maybe just from the fact that we have a large platform, effectively, that could potentially be by mistake, oftentimes I think impacted by hackback. I think that's why maybe we're a little bit more conservative, but the definitions that were just outlined or sort of in broad strokes, I think we principally agree with. I think the intent, as Seth was mentioning, I think is particularly important. I think that's kind of also, to me, when you just look at the term, like the hacking back, the back part of it is, to me, signifies retaliatory action, even though it's sort of in the conversations is often the definition, it seems to be often a little bit more broader. But I think for us, it's a question of ensuring that you stride that line between what is retaliatory action, which should be frowned upon, and what is actual activity that is done in an effort to protect your own environment. As I mentioned earlier, because we're a platform, I think for us it's much more, it's a scarier space than maybe for some of the other more security-focused companies. But Cloudflare is in a similar position. So I think maybe that to start us off.
So this is interesting. Let me dive into this retaliatory question here for a second, because I think it's something that's going to color the discussion as we go. Since the announcement of the Paris Call, we've had significant development, at least in the United States, on this strategy around Defend Forward, where American military cyber operations and intelligence operations are looking to push beyond American networks to gather information and blunt attacks much closer to the source. This is just a strategy for government organizations, but it illustrates the utility of a proactive defense. And it speaks to something that's a common refrain in the industry, to be moving not just within your own networks, but to be listening beyond and trying to get ahead of the attacker cycle. And so to this group, I'm curious, how much of your thinking about the hackback debate or the hackback debate generally is colored by this understanding of it as solely retaliatory action? How much does the discussion change if it's proactive to try and prevent an attack as preventative? Let's go in the same order if we could, Alyssa, then Seth and Kaya.
So I actually think it's an important component, but not necessarily for the reasons that you suggested. I think the question is really the action piece of that, as opposed to just the listening component. So the retaliation piece is not just about the intent of what you're trying to do, but it's potentially, well, I guess it's related to the intent and the extent it's talking about the activities that you're actually engaged in. If you're thinking about going out and trying to figure out what's happening, that might be different than, for example, taking action to take it back or to encrypt it or to take something that is actually activity. So I think there's a little bit of a gap there. It's so where it's not just the sort of I want to do harm or I want to retaliate question, but also what action am I taking? And what does that then look like? So I don't necessarily see sort of an information gathering exercise the same way as I would see an activity beyond. And I think that the latter is much more potentially damaging for exactly the reasons that Kaya flagged. Even as someone in industry who has a network, the concerns about potentially being a victim of hackback or an attempted hackback, things go around, shall we say. So even being both a cybersecurity company and an owner of a network, you have to be worried about both sides of it.
Seth, what about you?
I agree, Alyssa. I think as an international company, we always have to believe in protecting our global assets and interests, and then simultaneously adhering to international law. So there's this gray area of whether or not active listening or collecting data to thwarting an attack. There's that gray and everything in between. So, so I think that active defense, as I spoke about earlier, will continue to harden and expand. So it's non-retaliatory in nature to collect that information if it's shared with a legal and government entity.
I had to unmute myself. I think I would agree with that. I think in addition, I would also, as I look at like someone with like a large network. So a lot of the stuff that we look at from a just observation perspective is on our networks, or the majority that we see. And that is definitely something that is considered defensive, in particular if you don't necessarily do anything about it, except perhaps patch your own system because you discovered that someone is actually trying to sniff around a particular vulnerability or something like that. But it's definitely an important part of our defensive strategy, because you mentioned governments. Trey, I think, on Friday, we published a blog post about how we've seen a particular government entity effectively surveilling, spying, trying to steal information from vaccine researchers on COVID-19. So, that was on our systems, but it's definitely something that we keep an eye on, and in both in terms of, government and criminal actions.
Welcome, Ed. We're into this discussion around the extent to which retaliatory is a key part of the hackback discussion. So Kaya and Alyssa, I think, both flagged something really interesting, which is thinking about the nature of the act as well as the intent. And I'm willing to buy this, but it seems like a potentially flexible definition, especially given that the Paris Call calls to prohibit hackback, where the methods I'm using to gather information about these adversaries and to monitor their activities could very well lean into the kinds of access on an adversary network or a foreign network that might be considered prohibited. So maybe this is to come back to the group. Let's go Alyssa, Seth, Kaya, and then Ed. When you think about this prohibition in your mind, what's on the right side of the definition and what's being prohibited?
So I actually will come back to sort of the point that Kai and I both made about being on both sides of the of a potentially subject to hackback as well. I think what we're trying to do is to make sure that we don't have a bunch of vigilante. The sort of overall nature of the Paris call is that we don't have a bunch of vigilante actors trying to, because they can, trying to think about how they then operate in cyberspace. We actually want a set of norms about what is acceptable and what is not. And one component of that set of norms is to say that private actors shouldn't, just because they think they're wearing a white hat, shouldn't be going out and trying to reclaim information or trying to reclaim trying to take activity against potentially bad actors. I think that the challenge, I think, in the space is that exactly where those limits are can be tricky. I think the reality of cyberspace is that there are always going to be gray areas on exactly what looks like something that is intrusion in systems, for example, that where there's the exact activity that itself is hackback is always going to be slightly gray. And I think that the prohibition component actually gets at some of what we already have in law. We have a bunch of restrictions about what is permissible already. And I think that those are really useful exercise to understand that a lot of some of the things that we would potentially be talking about are already prohibited in a variety of different countries. So it's not clear to me that we have to fully legally define what constitutes hackback, as long as we have a sort of shared understanding that certain kinds of actions are unacceptable and should generally be something that is not only frowned on, but is recognized as potentially criminal from a private actor standpoint. I think that's very different than what happens on the government side, and I think that understanding the distinction of when something should be government action versus when it can be private action is one of the most important parts of the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I think the physical realm has a solid foundation that extends to the digital realm. It comes down to intent, right? So you see this gradual move from things like honeypots and sinkholing. People are using DLP and UBA, data tagging. It gets a little bit gray when you start talking about tripwires and landmines. And in the physical realm, we have dye packets in a bank when somebody steals money from a vault. Little grayer in the digital world. So as data starts to be tracked or destroyed or encrypted, that line is still not quite defined. So it's an interesting and thought-provoking conversation, I think.
And maybe I'll just add or reinforce something with that Alisa said. I think it's important for all of us to remember, there's a clear statement in the Paris call on a prohibition on no hackback. And I think that's largely been because there's been conversations around potentially allowing it, right? I think pretty much everywhere where there are cybercrime laws, it is prohibited because it would break a cybercrime law. If you look at the US legislation, if you look at a bunch of European legislations, the ones I'm most familiar with, it's so the question here a lot of the time is would you want to weaken those protections that already exist to allow private sector actors or individuals for that matter, to act offensively and aggressively in cyberspace? To me, the answer is no. I would say another point, not just that it's really different that what states do, and obviously Microsoft encourages states to do less of those things, but it's also the middle ground, I would say, where private sector actors or even white hackers can partner and work with law enforcement in particular to bring down criminals and in an offensive manner. So with authority from governments, I think that's also another angle that is something that's much more common and it's vetted and people have a conversation versus not me, because I don't know how, but an engineer somewhere deciding that, they see something bad and they want to help in reality. I think completely from a helpful perspective. And then potentially the person on the other side could sit in China or North Korea and perhaps in a government. And so even worse than attacking a private sector provider, it could have really, really bad consequences for the world. I've gone dramatic, sorry.
No, I think I would add, and sorry for the technical difficulties, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. Great panel, great discussion. I think from a perspective is, yes, it's not only a technology challenge in cyber. There's not a one-for-one from physical, as was being discussed earlier. I think now we're getting into also international law as well. I mean, given the challenge of what is decided as a criminal act from a Hackingback perspective, I think that definition is going to vary, and sometimes it's not even defined in a lot of countries. And so the question is how do you do that without minimizing, if you're a corporation attempting or thinking of doing this to defend yourself, what can you do without exposing yourself to obviously litigation within the country, but internationally. So I think here it is interesting, and it's a great topic to understand what are the lanes in the road. And unfortunately, we're talking about a dirt road. There's no lanes. And so we have to, obviously think from a perspective, say from a private industry perspective, think that this is, there's a lot of exposure here. And then what is this, return on investment, so to speak? What's the cost benefit analysis of doing Hackback, to further, mitigate the threats that you're facing. So is it the last result? If not, you're going to go under as an entity because you're being, attacked incessantly. I mean, I don't know what that definition is or where that bar is, but I think ultimately everything has to be put on the table and to be considered. I think from a law enforcement perspective, I think when we start talking about those lanes in the road, albeit maybe not a dirt road, but definitely not a well-paved road, is that it's paved in the sense that, yes, there is a historic case precedent, international law and working with other countries, but there's very gray areas and pitfalls, even from a law enforcement perspective. What are they doing to further their investigation? And are they doing activities that are seemed or deemed illegal in those countries? So it's a very, I'm glad we have a lot of time to discuss.
So let's push on this a little bit. And I think it's interesting, there's a little bit of a distinction emerging. For some of you, there's clear set of definitions already in domestic law that we pick up and carry forth as this, to carry for this definition. For others, there's maybe more ambiguity. So let's think about the US in particular for a second, right? A lot of the architecture around Hackback for the US rests on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is premised on the idea of authorized access or not and protected computer systems. So to some extent, we have the degree to which what you're doing has been permitted or been agreed to. And we have this network boundary question again. Is this something that you're allowed to touch? So I'm curious what we see, what this group sees as the major dividing line using that authorization and network boundary architecture. Where's that boundary of this is permissible, this is the kind of thing a private sector entity should be doing, either as a service or in conjunction with a larger platform provider, and this is over the line? And I wonder if we could start with Kaya, then go Seth, Ed, and with Alyssa.
So I think I largely would say that it probably depends a little bit. I still think overarchingly, it should be no. But I think the reason why I say it depends a little bit is it is the question of intent, and it is the question of if we broaden the conversation a little bit, right? It is and part of the reason why I want to do this is just to make sure that everybody on kind of follows through with the conversation, just because I know not everybody is computer experts. So some of the, I think as we go forward, some of the terms like sinkholing and stuff like that would be good if we explain it. It's the, so to make, there is a, obviously if you look at the sort of things like penetration testing, just because I'm looking at some of the questions that are being raised on the side chat as well, or vulnerability disclosure, those are obviously things that I would not consider hackback, and I think the vast majority of the industry does not consider them hackback. But some like penetration testing is done with explicit permission of the vendor in question. The vulnerability research, while not done with explicit permission with the vendor in question, but it's again done with a particular objective, the objective being trying to find and fix vulnerabilities. And if it goes through a particular process of like coordinated vulnerability disclosure, I think the not vast majority, but a lot of vendors will accept and work and reward the researchers who do those things. But I think that is still a shift that needs to happen in the industry more broadly, but I think we're getting there. But and on the other side, you have the question of sort of intent being more malicious. So that's the complete extreme, right? Just hacking on complete other. This way is good intent. This is really bad intent. So you're a bad actor. You want to do bad things. And the hackback, as we I think are talking about it here, is somewhere in the middle, right? Is the intent is positive because it's defensive, but hopefully, but the rules of the road and the knowledge of what is happening is sort of a little bit murky. And so that's where I think that's why I'm a bit like, it's a sliding scale. I'm just not explaining really well.
So I think you did great, Kai. So it's complicated, right? I think that's the challenge here, right? So we're balancing offensive and defensive within a legal framework, right? So where do those boundaries start and end? And I think we all know that the law is not going to keep up with the technology, albeit it's foundational, and there's a lot that could move from the physical to the digital realm. So I think it's a great place to start. But I do go back to the active defense, right, and collaborating, with legal and government so that we can keep those boundaries in as much sync as possible. So there's always going to be these legal, ethical, and practical standards that we're going to have to adhere to. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Ed?
No, yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. Seth hit it on the head. I mean, arguably, it's that active defense. I think the what Kaya was referring to or speaking to also is something that has to be really discussed and defined. And as Seth said, the legal framework, so to speak, is that lagging indicator. It's not being updated as it should. You look at the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act here in the United States, and it definitely, needs to be updated. But then everybody is sort of hand wrings when we're talking about updating. What does it do and what does it allow? So I think the challenge going forward is from the vulnerability researchers. Trend Micro, we have our 0-day initiative, and about 3,000 researchers that participate, and that becomes a challenge. I think, and a concern from a research perspective, as they do their research, at what point could it be misconstrued or seen? And again, we spoke to intent here earlier, and so intent is very critical. So, but a lot of complicated issues on what is that. But I think the one thing we can agree on, at least I think we can, is what Seth was saying was the active defense piece. Now working with governments and or law enforcement, to further a criminal investigation, so to speak. Just to make sure there are some checks and balances and that. I think ultimately the biggest challenge with anything that might be construed as hacking back is that collateral damage. Compromised infrastructure is used on a I wouldn't say even an hourly basis. Every second around the world, there is compromised infrastructure that's being, leveraged and utilizing or doing international attacks, be it from ransomware to traditional data breaches and so forth. So I think that's where the focus could be and where we could focus our efforts to see where we can expand that cooperation and collaboration. I think, when we think of the terms like we've talked about earlier, is that truly hacking back and doing offensive work. That gets into that challenging, complicated, gray area.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of those things. I think the other piece to think about, and this gets to your question in the first instance, is that the definitions that we use in the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, it's not intended to focus exclusively on hacking back. And I think that's what you're getting at some of the tension when Kaya was talking about the spectrum. It's covering activities on that one side of the spectrum, which extends far beyond hacking back. It extends into the malicious activities as well. And I think that was the point of the idea that there's a continuum. And I think personally, I think that may be okay. I think you're right where Ed's right that we need to sort of flesh out exactly what that means from a research standpoint, and make sure that we give enough leeway for people who do have good intent, who are actually trying to address the vulnerabilities in the system. But I don't think that necessarily means that we need to fully update it for the purpose of hack back. And that to me there is an important distinction between those two. And I think one of the questions on disclosure, how we get into exactly what we're trying to do with the information, what the goals are, again, going back to that intent question, that's where it becomes relevant. If you're not trying to take retaliatory action on it, but you are trying to make sure that someone can do, as we've said, active defense, or to harden their system using the information that you have, those are all things that we want to encourage. So the concern, I think, when we get into the law space is how do we encourage the appropriate behavior without taking something that could be long-term damaging and have a lot of collateral consequences that we're not prepared to deal with. And frankly, I think that on the piece that sort of Ed flagged on the concerns about infrastructure, I think it's broader than that too. I think it's really important that we have a set of norms, because things can get really out of control very quickly if you don't have rules in place to do things. So the question of when something is a hackback versus when something is an active hack, you can imagine, if the question is really entirely about intent, there's a whole world of people who could potentially say, well, I was actually trying to do something good. I was just trying to get into the systems to show you that I could provide the information back. And so understanding that those lines are necessarily going to be a little fuzzy, and that we're going to have to navigate the sort of uncomfortableness or discomfort with the intent space. I think something that just comes up as part of that, but that doesn't diminish the idea of building a set of norms or prohibiting something that looks like affirmative hackback or any of those things. We just have to, understand that there's going to be some gray in the center.
This is helpful, I think, in listening to this discussion, right, to understand to the point made about the spectrum, but also the degree of ambiguity when we bring in something like intent, that you could potentially have seen a rephrasing of, encouraging good faith hackback, right, or understanding where there are acceptable activities in that definition, and that one singular category of denied or banned activities doesn't necessarily help us. We have a couple of different representatives from private industry here, and I know we've invoked the name a number of times, so I wonder if we could come back and for each of you, just address quickly, we have this question of what role does industry play in a hackback discussion, but I'm curious, what makes each of your entities, their interests or your equities unique, or at least different? And why don't we start with Ed, then go Alyssa, Seth, and end with Kaya.
Yes, absolutely. So the hackback is something that's you wouldn't think. So Trend Micro, we're a cybersecurity solutions company around for 30 years, and we do an extensive amount of threat and vulnerability research. So therein lies a lot of the where we come in and on the research side on from not only the vulnerability research that we were just talking about, but also the threat research. So we do an extensive amount of threat research on criminal undergrounds, threat actor groups, but in doing so, we oftentimes get and find or stumble across evidence of criminal activity. And that's where we work with international law enforcement quite extensively when this happens. And so, if you think about from a threat intelligence sharing model, you have strategic, operational, and tactical. And so a lot of this becomes a tactical type of threat intelligence information sharing, where we work with the law enforcement. Once we realize that we do have something of note that we need to share, we reach out to those, those entities that have jurisdiction, right? And it's just not one agency. It could be multiple agencies on a lot of these cases. I think that was more for the par for the course. But that's when we work with law enforcement, international law enforcement, to do that. I mean, so from when we're talking about Hackingback and these are the discussions, that's where, at what point our researchers are fantastic researchers and do a great job, but there's always, this assessment and continuous assessment on each case on are we doing what we need to be doing? One, check for the greater good, but two, are we doing in such a manner that doesn't expose us to any kind of liability, them being researchers individually and or as a company. So for us, this is near and dear to our heart. And, there's a lot of consternation when it comes to if there is a tightening of the definition, be it for vulnerability research and or even threat research. And so for us, that's where we sort of lie on this intersection of this discussion is from a private industry. We're there pretty much actively. The question is how do we do it responsibly and but effectively, right, for the greater good?
Seth?
Did you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Seth, you want to hit that in terms of what's unique about NetApp?
Yeah. So I don't think this directly intersects with, the line of business or this. There's a specific industry that plays a direct role. There are groups that are closer to this, like Trend Micro with Ed, where they're kind of on the edge and they can help supply that information. And I think we can all contribute to that same, but it ultimately is a matter of law and public-private partnership. I think there's some good arguments about certain types of industries that might need additional assistance in this realm. So, critical infrastructure, healthcare, those for the social and well-being of individuals. That's going to require, I think, a bit more thought about, how to protect and collaborate with those industries where, folks like Ed or NetApp, where we can help provide that information into a, public forum, similar to like what we do with ISACs today, and make it a public-private partnership where we can collaborate and then, let the law and entities then, take that information and work with that.
Alyssa?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to think about our different companies and who potentially is most affected or affected in different ways. I think that there are other industries that aren't even represented here that obviously have potentially have interesting things to say about it as well. I think for us, so Cloudflare has a big global network. We provide both cybersecurity on that network and do performance services. We have more than 25 million websites that use our service. So we have a sort of massive global view on what's happening, which is interesting for us on the threat side of it, because we can see threats across our network in a really significant way. And of course, once you see a threat across your network, the ability to sort of protect others from it is an important piece. I think one thing that we also collect threats from that standpoint, or we look for threats. I think the challenge for us is that the idea of active defense, for example, isn't something that we affirmatively seek to do. We see that as a cooperation with law enforcement, a cooperation with larger groups as well, recognizing that should be their purview, so from our standpoint. So I think that we have a lot of the information to provide that would potentially be useful in that space, but our sort of action in response to it is to collaborate with others who can then potentially take action. Generally, I think one sort of industry piece that we haven't talked about that I think might be useful to talk about, though, is the people who would take the information that we have, for example, and provide tools to do affirmative hackback, right? So we have different sides of the equation of who's potentially involved in this space. There is an industry of people certainly who provides a set of tools that can be used once the threat information is out there. And I think one of the interesting things that Seth raised or brought up is that the notion that certain industries need help. I think we have to think about what the limits of that help are as well. When you have potentially tools for hire in certain areas like Hackback that might raise even more concerns than a company that really sort of affirmatively has ties already or is engaged. That looks a little bit different to me. So understanding again sort of where those limits are and who's potentially involved, I think they're useful parts of the conversation.
And maybe, I don't think I will say very many things that are new. In terms of, Microsoft, the global player, obviously providing, both cloud computing services to your still traditional desktop type services, as well as we have a large cybersecurity operation. I think we look at this from a perspective of protecting ourselves and our customers more than anything else. So the vast majority of the times we'd look at people who are already active on our networks, because there are many, it is a large network, and find ways to disable them. But as Alyssa and Seth and Ed all said, we always do that in cooperation with law enforcement. I think the one example that probably is the most well known is our work with various law enforcement agencies around the world on botnet takedowns. Where I think it's not just that we provide the information. I think a lot of times we pioneered creative legal strategies, I would say, to work with law enforcement to encourage them to think about this online environment in a slightly different way than they would normally think about it. As for a lot of law enforcement officials around the world, this is a very new space. So that's the other thing I think where tech companies can add a fair amount. Is getting almost capacity building with law enforcement entities around the world to take some of these bad actors down. And some of it is you actually put on training, and some of it is working on specific cases together, which I think has been helpful over the last few years. I would also pull on the point that Alyssa mentioned around the private sector actor industry that sells some of these tools. Everybody on this call or this webinar panel is a member of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, which part of the reason why the group was pulled together was to make a really clear statement about not engaging in those type of activities, not engaging in developing and selling offensive tools. A little bit like we're talking about norms earlier or more broadly for governments. I think something like this for private sector actors is also critical. Just drawing the line in the sand in terms of what's helpful, what's not helpful, and sort of what's harmful to go even more further than helpful.
So it's interesting, a number of you mentioned in talking about your own equities, the law enforcement community. And there's a bit of an emerging thread where, if we're handing off to law enforcement or we're sort of acting with law enforcement, and that might expand the scope of permissible activities, or, we're merely a collaborator supporting, they're really the big stick. I want to ask about kind of breaking this model a little bit, because I think we're all assuming we're working with government entities that are relatively mature, relatively capable, have the ability even to interact with some of these private sector partners to even communicate. I think to Kaya's point, the amount of capacity building that goes on for certain governments in certain parts of the world to understand these problems and really educate how they can get, as a law enforcement entity, their hands around them is significant. So think, if we could, for a moment, where in the context of our Hackback discussion, we're not talking about working with a state with mature offensive, defensive, and sort of counter-criminal capabilities, but rather a developing country, somewhere that has far less capacity to act. Does our understanding of Hackback change when it's with a government that either doesn't have the capacity to act, or is actually asking or implying that private sector entities could be acting on their behalf, where they don't have the ability to respond? And if we could start with Alyssa and then go Ed, Kaya, Seth.
Yeah, that's sort of where I was going with some of the points. I think the government component of that is really interesting, and I think actually, I think it's really challenging. And this gets to a bigger point, which is that this isn't the only area where we need more development of norms, right? It's not just the private industry component or laws and norms. I think the government component is actually really important too, because I think that there's a pretty significant challenge in privatizing law enforcement in that way. So if you actually have a government entity that is not particularly capable and is certainly less capable than the private actor that they're then contracting with, the question of who is in control and what the limits are is just much harder to figure out. And I think it's sort of it's akin to sort of a private militia, right? It's a question, you get into questions of control and what are the appropriate limits and who's actually overseeing them. And if you don't have the capability inherent in the government, you chances are also don't have the oversight that you would want in a government actor generally. So I think, to me, those are things. Yes, capability building, as Kaya suggested, is an important component, but that in part is building up structures, not just on the offensive tool side or not on the offensive tool side, but really on the understanding what you're talking about. What are we trying to do here? What are defensive strategies? What are actually potentially, what are appropriate laws that govern this space? How do we make sure that there are appropriate checks in place? So there's a lot of capacity building that has nothing to do with the notion of sort of offensive capability. That I think is really important to talk about. I personally, the description that you gave, Trey, is one of those things that makes me really, really nervous from a private company side. And I'm probably not alone there, as I see other people on the call smiling too.
Yeah, I would agree. This is because it is true, as I was even making the statements about working with governments. Yeah, all governments are not created equal. All intentions of those governments are not created equal. So this becomes definitely a slippery slope. If, speaking from the private industry side of, what support do you provide and under what form, right? That's a challenge, I think. I couldn't speak to a blanket statement, but I think for us it would be, a huge challenge and a huge hill to climb to provide some kind of support that might be misconstrued or seen as like we're talking here is this private militia or type of discussions. I think providing the level of support needed to that government in as much as providing information sharing, but I think the equation or the analysis always has to be looked at is what is the outcome of that support? What are we talking about? Is this agreed upon criminal activity or as we know, what's happening in a lot of countries is these countries going after political figures and so forth via cyber means. And so I think it's one of these things that an assessment is done, has to be done, right? If that type of support is requested on, where we lie on. I mean, and it's, I'll be like every good attorney would say, it depends is the answer, right? It all depends on the situation, depends on the outcome, and depends on the country, organization, or law enforcement entity. So there would be a lot of analysis. I mean, I think that's why we sort of, obviously in the United States, we work with the FBI and Secret Service and, Homeland Security investigations, but also, internationally with NCA and so forth. I mean, those types of cooperations and relationships are easy and been long rooted, since we were created 30 years ago. So I think that those are easier questions. So I might be punting on this answer.
Kaya, then Seth.
Yeah, and I think I would almost build on this. Just to I think to remember, these are all international companies. Perhaps domiciled in a particular country, but operating internationally. And I think it's some of the concerns that were raised, or just at the beginning about acting in cyberspace and then unintentionally attacking someone that you might not want to, I think still apply, even if governments are involved. I think the points that Ed raised about the potential reputational fallback, and also just, the ethical moral compass of the companies that sort of stand for a particular way of doing business or stand for human rights and privacy, I think would be, I think it would be really challenging to give a blanket answer, and would be really challenging to also to just be like, we will always, work with governments on something like this. I think it's much more likely that we will, in a lot of cases, if compelled, push back and drag them to courts to not do that. So again, I think it's not an easy answer, but I think I think there is something in, as Alyssa was saying, educating governments and others in the industry, to be entirely honest, on both the practices, just cybersecurity practices, and again, law enforcement practices, but also on some of the human rights dimensions in this space. I think it's equally important, and we shouldn't, as much as cybersecurity, I think, is our bread and butter of the people on the call. I think it's human rights across the board is not something we should forget.
Yeah, I agree with the previous panelists. It's a great and complicated question. I mean, ultimately, laws still apply. It's similar to warfare, right? The difference here is, I think, attribution is still challenging, right? And getting this wrong is very costly. So there might be room here for international assistance, more of those public-private partnerships. But ultimately, this is one of those things that it could be a very costly error if not done well.
This is interesting listening to this. I mean, I say this having been based in the U.S. for all of my professional career, but it's a very Western frame we're coming to this with, right? There's a kind of an assumption of a clear formal definition of what the state is, easy and robust distinction between the state and the private sector. We're not considering necessarily situations where political parties seen as legitimate also have militias, right? Also are working with non-state groups on a regular basis. I'm thinking about Microsoft's takedowns, for example. They're typically rooted in intellectual property law, right? Their trademark infringement, their copyright infringement, which is robust, but kind of an esoteric, legal tradition solidly in I think our practice. So it's helpful, I think, for all coming back and thinking about this again. We have a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of stickiness in what we're talking about here. I want to poke at one other sticky case and then go to a couple of questions from the group here. Thinking about hacker for hire companies. vendors in the space who are making, I would say, gangbusters business that are recognized in some quarters as legitimate, criticized in others as significant threats to human rights around the world, selling offensive capabilities, supporting in some cases those offensive capabilities, leaning very close to, or maybe even reaching over that line on behalf of governments. Where do they fit in the hackback discussion? And I'm curious for those on the call, we think about, a couple of entities that have been named: the Indian group Bahamut, the UAE's Dark Matter, the Israeli NSO group. Should the construction and sale of these kinds of offensive cyber capabilities be seen as hackback? And is there a distinction in your mind between sale and support? Why don't we go with Alyssa and then Seth, Ed, and Kaya?
Had to go with me first on that one, huh? No, I actually think that I think we get into a very complicated set of legal questions when we get into those kinds of companies, in part because of the question that you just asked, which was focused on governments, which is really not about private hackback at all, right? So we get into sort of the human rights issues very quickly when you get into hacker for hire questions, because you are potentially talking about abuse of those capabilities. And then there's an underlying question for those companies of, what is acceptable use of those tools? Is there acceptable use of those tools? Is government use of those tools acceptable, and in what cases and for what? So I think that the challenge with a lot of those companies, it becomes relevant to hackback because it's a question of whether you can sell those tools to private companies who could potentially take action based on whatever parameters they see fit. And that's where some of the lines, I think, in the Paris call come really into play. So can you go, me as a private actor not in the cybersecurity space, can I go hire a company to do something that looks like hackback just because that's what I think I want to do? I find that to be something that would be prohibited by the Paris call idea, right? And I think that would be a potential problem. But I think that those companies raise other issues that almost automatically get sort of filtered into the conversation, because it does raise the question about what is the appropriate space for what should governments be doing in this space? When is it appropriate for governments to do things that look like what we're calling hackback? And I think it might be a little bit out of the parameters of this conversation, but that's why those companies, I think, raise so many challenges. It does get into a whole set of issues on, as Kai said before, on human rights and appropriate action, and what governments have legitimate interests in that space and have the ability to take action. So they're really interesting questions. I am glad I don't work at a hacker for hire company. So just leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely needs legal oversight. That line about where also, who can use those companies, whether it's a government or non-government organization, how that fits in a legal framework, where the liability is if something goes wrong, due to incorrect attribution. So it raises, I think, a lot more questions at this point than we might have answers for. But I think ultimately it still needs to fit within that framework.
Yeah, I would say maybe a framework to look at, or at least to bring up in the discussion, is the fact that, obviously in the physical world, you have, from a defense industrial base perspective, you have companies selling arms internationally to various countries. So in a sense, that is an accepted legal practice and business practice. I mean, there is guardrails to that, but I think that essence of providing capacity building in the forms of tools could be akin to providing from an arms perspective. Although a lot of people cringe when you say arms and cyber and stuff like that at times, because obviously not a complete one-for-one, but still, I think here that framework is a difference of providing tools or capacity building and or training. And then you have on the other side is that you're actually hiring a company almost like from a mercenary perspective. So, international laws around, private armies and being, leveraged and stuff like that. And so I would draw those two distinctions. I have no answers to say one is better than the other, but at least in my mind, that's how I think about it. to try to put those in proper buckets. Obviously, there's spillover and it's gray areas, but I think definitely we need a lot more, a lot more discussion, but also a lot more, accepted, guidance to do that, right? Or norms, or, for this type of activity. Laws.
And maybe just to almost summarize, I think to me it is, there's the value of the Paris call to an extent is in the fact that it brought together so many governments, so many industry, but it's still not all of them, right? It's 78-ish maybe governments, so that's not everyone. Right, so not everyone subscribes to this idea of hackback or even hack for hire is a problematic issue, and we see this also in terms of export control agreements. What Ed was saying, right? So it might be illegal in the U.S., it might be illegal in Slovenia, but it might not be illegal in Israel, right? So at that point, you're like, that's a decision for that legal system. We from here can be like, yeah, I also would not want to work for a private hackback company, but there's people and there's environments where that is perfectly acceptable. And then it's a question on the international level: how do we manage, regulate the sale of these technologies across borders? And obviously for the private sector, as Alyssa was saying, that gets really complicated really quickly. When the buyer is a government, the area gets very murky very quickly as well. And so I think that's kind of where I would probably try and draw a line.
Interesting listening to this, and useful that private military contractors kind of finally bubbled up to the surface here right at the end of our discussion. Although obviously not a perfect parallel, there is an interesting question around where those entities operate, that it is typically not Europe, the United States, again, areas with strong formal legal institutions, that it is more often the developing world or areas that are failed states. And I'm wondering if there's some parallels as we think about in the hackback space, where everybody's happy to take down North Korean infrastructure, right? If it's a French surveillance company, if it's a German national intelligence organization, it looks very different. And so I think it's helpful for us to, again, be thinking about some of those implicit assumptions. Anyway, let's go to the panel. Let's go to the room. We have a question from a gentleman here. Can the panel members comment on the 2020 Australian cybersecurity strategy that provides critical infrastructure providers more powers to protect themselves against cyber attacks? So more broadly, as we see some governments starting to open up, and it's interesting, you open up the Australian cybersecurity strategy and they mention the word protect themselves, that phrase appears almost a dozen times. How do we feel about similar efforts or policies are being shifted to allow sectors to protect themselves more effectively, potentially open up the realm for more hackback-like activities? Again, I think, and just to color the question, we have technology companies on this call mostly thinking about or working in security. This is to suggest hackback by non-technical security vendors, right? Your power, distributor, the owner of your water purification facility. So I'm curious what the group thinks about this, if it is a trend. Why don't we go Ed, Kaya, Alyssa, Seth?
No, I think I'm not 100% familiar with the details, but arguably, like what we've been talking about before, I think when we start, it's in the definition, right? It's in the guardrails. What is allowable? To allow somebody to effectively protect themselves, like Seth was saying earlier, this act of defense, definition, and what does that mean? Or is this truly a hackback situation where there's this complete offensive component to it? I don't know. And then obviously I do recognize there's complete gray areas, but then it's obviously, to your point, the challenge of technical organizations and companies doing this, and what capacity do that? What are the chances of them, having some collateral damage if it in fact is some, taking down some infrastructure that, coincidentally is being utilized for legitimate use, and you have shut down X on the other part of the country or so forth, or around the world. So I think, yeah, to speak to it, I like the idea of increasing the capability or options in a very narrow focus from an active defense perspective, and really drawing out what are the possibilities there, but obviously giving them a sort of a complete, card, to be able to do what they want to do. I think that's definitely a challenge.
So I would agree. I think it's terrifying as an idea.
Very specific.
But I think, but even, and I'm not going to pretend I'm super familiar. I think it's probably the thing that's referred to is probably the critical infrastructure proposal that's floating around. But I think that in there, as my understanding is, sorry, that's the dog. My understanding is that it's not even necessarily giving, it's not necessarily giving the critical infrastructure providers the powers to do stuff, but more the Australian government to directly intervene, which I also think probably oversteps the boundary of where we'd want to sort of the line to be drawn. Just while I understand the desire and need to protect your own critical infrastructure, I think if each country would suddenly put forward proposals and actively try to change the technology that's being used, I think it would be an unworkable situation given that we have global platforms.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I actually don't think, I think one of the interesting challenges in this space is that this is our language issue that we've talked about before. I don't actually think that the Australia cybersecurity strategy was trying to get at this notion of hackback. I think that they were trying to encourage people to do more defensively, to think more aggressively about what they could potentially do. I don't think it was extending all the way to hackback. And I think this is the sort of language challenge that we often have. And it's putting sort of real terms behind what we mean. This is it's where does it stand on the continuum? I think people, particularly in industries that are not in the cybersecurity space generally, don't often realize all of the things that they can do that have nothing to do with hackback. It sounds, but you're talking about potentially industries that don't have sort of traditionally haven't had robust cybersecurity defenses. And so being a little bit more open to think about what your defensive measures can be, still defensive, not offensive in the hackback sense, still defensive, but just being a little bit more aggressive and thinking about what you can do and making sure that you actually have a robust strategy on defense. Is, I think, really important. So you don't want to diminish that by sort of scaring them off and saying there are you're not allowed to do X, you're not allowed to do Y. You want to encourage them to be more strategic about their defense. But again, I think that barrier ends. There's a barrier at some point that where it doesn't extend to something that looks like more aggressive offensive action, which is where you end up in that sort of hackback space.
Yeah, I'm not, I think like the panel well versed in the Australian framework, but I think the sentiment is the same. It's where do you expand the defensive measures in order to protect, especially things, as like I mentioned before, things like critical infrastructure and health systems, where the need for tightening and hardening the defensive measures are absolutely going to be expanded. But I think the sentiment is the same with the key principles. I don't think that shifts regardless.
Right. So another from the field here to anyone who feels particularly percolated to answer. When would the private industry be justified in considering Hackingback to promote safety and security online? Particularly, do social media companies have more justification in Hackingback if press freedom is attacked? Should this response differ depending on the attack by a non-government party or government party? Curious if anyone feels strongly about this.
The only thing I would add, I mean, since nobody else is responding, I think from the perspective of, private industry, where would we even think about, or when would we think about doing Hackingback and be it the justification associated with it. I think when you're looking at, health and life and safety are in play is an easier, point to, or, sort of level to do it from a protecting liberty. I think that is a gray area. And I think we've all seen that there's challenges from any perspective you might look at it, when you're looking at that type of activity, but I think when you're looking at, I think it's an easier thing to justify, be it from a private industry perspective, is what are we doing? Or if we don't do something, could somebody, something be hurt or something, or be hurt, or health and life and safety issues. And so arguably, I just throw that out there as a possibility, but it is truly a very complex situation. And I don't think any company organization is, too keen to step up and answer these types of questions unless they are ultimately have to.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think one of the challenges, and this is sort of what Ed was getting at, is the hackback is a very aggressive measure, right? I mean, I think that's maybe what people haven't fully appreciated. It's not something that you do lightly, and the questions, I think there's some difficult questions around what happens with things like press freedom if you have something that's clearly intended to sort of suppress action, particularly if it's in a place where maybe those freedoms are not that robust. So if you went to law enforcement in a country where it seems to be targeting something, and those freedoms aren't there, I think it raises extra challenges. At the same time, I think the problem is that, again, the question doesn't sort of fully appreciate the significance of the hackback as the tactic in response. And I think that's what Ed was getting at. So is there ever a circumstance when hackback is appropriate if life is on the line, if it's really sort of there's something that is the significance is at that level, it might look different. And there might be circumstances where you could work with other entities to potentially address the concern. I think that as important an issue as something like press freedom is, it's not going to be seen in exactly that same light. And so the likelihood of it going there, as important as the underlying issue is, it's very hard to imagine a circumstance where that is something that certainly I would see as justifying hackback, when I don't think hackback is almost ever justified, going back to the sort of Paris call piece.
But this is interesting, right? I think listening to these answers, because we know that there's a couple of entities in this discussion that offer, for example, Google has Project Shield, DDoS protection, Cloudflare has, I think it's Cloudflare for campaigns, right? And thinking about
Project Galileo, yeah, for in the media. Yeah.
These are intended to be aimed at these groups, seen to be high risk or high value, vulnerable populations in this information ecosystem. And at least the intent appears common there, if not the act. And I think, Alyssa, to your point, right, there's a massive distinction between protecting against a denial of service attack and moving proactively against an adversary, although the intent may match. So I think helps
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly the distinction I would give. We think that those things are incredibly important from a defense standpoint, but that doesn't extend to something that would look like Hackingback. The active component of that or the offensive component of that looks very different to us. So we see that as an absolutely important, critical set of services to provide, which is why we have a set of free services for entities that are particularly vulnerable in that space. But that doesn't mean that the hackback part of that is still a step beyond.
We have another question here from the room. One more question to examine would be whether hackback is a last resort or something that would remain as a last option. Could options such as the dirt road hackback be considered as an attentive measure to swiftly fix issues that otherwise can't be fixed in a time-bounded situation? So let me ask to the groups, anyone who feels up to respond. Thinking about a crisis situation where the consequences of failure to intervene are, for the purposes of the hypo, particularly severe. What is the potential expansion on the realm of permissible activity in trying to stop, block, or mitigate the actions of an adversary, let's say in a critical infrastructure network? Do you feel like the severity or time intensity might shift your sense of what's permitted activity here?
So maybe I'll go with that. So I think a lot of it is just basically what Elisa said. I will also say, even this is a hackback hypothetical scenario, but even if you look at information being processed in some of the, by us, for instance, when it comes to like a live terrorism scenario, like the speed of collaboration between the industry and government gets incredibly fast, right? I think if I remember correctly, I think this is out in the public realm, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, the government reached out, we responded, and it was less than an hour, right? So I think it was the attack was still going on when we started sharing information. So I think there's also we shouldn't just think about it then the private sector act alone. It's also, you could still go the traditional route if seeking sort of government approval and enforcement support, and it just has to happen much more fast given where we in this hypothetical scenario. I would also say, I would say this is important because some of the, I think, concerns that I have about this is like there's always that one hypothetical scenario, right? And I think that gets us on a slippery slope really quickly. And the idea of, oh, we'll just do it once, just because it's really important this time, I think is problematic, because it kind of establishes it as an accepted practice, like slowly, one by one, without people even noticing. So I'd be much happier if we try to find traditional ways to respond to situations.
Yeah, I agree, but I think there's room within the Paris Call principles for life safety, where we can, within that same framework, like you said, with making speed be the most important, but it can be done in within the legal framework with private and public partnership, especially when it comes to life safety. I think there's room for that in the principles.
I agree. And I think we've said it here. I think it's the public-private partnership, which is key. And I think there's been established, as Kaya said, and then there's obviously on the physical side as well, times where public-private partnership is able to do this quite quickly. And so I think the question or the distinction would be the unilateral thing. I don't think there's any organization, private industry, would want to undertake that, daunting, responsibility to do this unilaterally, because I find that very hard to believe that even if they wanted to or knew that I think they would obviously reach out and there would be a quick response to, in other words, if this private industry found something first and was needed to act, but even then, advising and working and collaborating with, be it law enforcement and or another entity, anti-terrorism, if that was the case, entity, that this all could be done very quickly.
Yeah, I just echo all of those things. I think it's also worth sort of, to Ed's point, just thinking about what we're talking about and how it would work in the physical realm. So if you got information that there was a terrorist attack, the first thing that you would do would not be to go after it yourself, right? As a private actor, the same thing. This is the same thing in cyberspace. So as we think about those pieces, the law enforcement angle or the government angle is incredibly important. It has to be a piece of it. And that's, I think, what all of us are saying when you get into to something that really is a threat to life and safety. It is there is a government angle that has to be involved.
Yeah, and I appreciate Kaya's, I think, concern about the one extreme hypothetical. We'll call it the Bush v. Gore scenario for this discussion. So for this group, we've got a number, it seems, of members of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, and a lot of people have mentioned partnership. So following on this theme, I'm curious what we think about the need for multi-stakeholder cooperation here, not just private sector to government, but including civil society, including multiple actors in the context of that public-private partnership. What should that look like in practice? Where does the Cybersecurity Tech Accord feature in these discussions, and open the room to anyone?
So I mean, not to go first, but if I had not seeing anyone else's microphone go off right away. I actually think that the private industry plays an important role because so much of the online space is held by private actors. The reality of helping build expectations, norms, principles, private entities have to sign up to them. And so we, as a group, I think that we can play a really important role in just developing what expectations should look like and what on the private industry side, private industries would hope to happen. And we can explain some of the consequences because we're seeing them on our networks, we're seeing them on our systems, and we're seeing the possibilities. So to me, of course, it's going to be a partnership. We all have to have a voice in this space. That's what multi-stakeholder looks like. But we can play a really important role in just making sure that the expectations are right from our side, that it's not that we have a voice at the table, that we can explain we can set expectations amongst ourselves, and we can sort of develop those as we have conversations with governments and civil society as well.
Yeah, and I've always liked the threat sharing model, similar to like what ISAC does or the certs globally. I think that's a great place to build on. There's a lot of multi-stakeholders there where there's good collaboration, a lot of sharing of information. So I think that would be a great opportunity to build on.
Yeah, and I would just completely agree, and I will just drop the email address in the chat window as well. But we'd love to, if you want to talk about these issues more and provide us feedback, we really appreciate it. So I'm just writing it now, but we'd love to hear from you.
That's I think the only thing I would add, absolutely, I think Seth said it, Alyssa said it, and obviously Kaya from the TechAccord perspective. But I think there's so much room, and there's existing programs and formats that already exist that we can expand upon. But arguably, there's need to be much more. And I always like to think when we talk about threat intelligence, information sharing, or threat intelligence in general, it's that strategic, operational, tactical. And I think strategically, the TechAccord capacity building awareness, that is phenomenal. And I think the area in the middle, I think the tactical piece is something that already happens, obviously from a law enforcement perspective internationally between themselves and governments and entities, and then where appropriate, private industry comes into play. But I think it's the operational piece. How can we improve this operational discussion on a daily basis, be it cyber threat, actor defense, or sharing of TTPs. This, the operational component, and in creating, like Alyssa said, more formalizing the norms and protocols. I think obviously the certs exist and great functions that they do, but where can we get a little bit more operational to be able to have a little bit more input on that side?
So it's interesting, helpful, I think, Kai, unless you want to jump in. So helpful thinking about the context that this conversation is sat in with respect to Paris Call. We've explored a lot today in thinking about what Hackback looks like, where intent matters, the activity matters, who the representative entities are that we're playing. I'm wondering for this group, given that the Hackback definition or the Hackback prohibition in the Paris Call is one of probably the most actionable, even though I know we're kind of talking through its diffusion and lack of definition. I wonder if folks here think that definition presents a really workable model for a ban, or if there's changes that you'd want to see as this process continues forward. What would you want to think about embedding in that sort of language to make a prohibition like that more effective, or at least more actionable?
So one thing actually I think that we haven't explored as much as I think might be helpful are the different aspects that it encompasses. So I actually don't think that the prohibition itself that's contained in the Paris Call is something that you want to put into law as is. I don't think that's quite where we want to go because of all of these sort of challenging questions that we're raising. At the same time, I think there also is space to do a lot of things that get at some of the same concerns. So, we were talking about hacking for hire, for example, and what restrictions apply on that. Well, one of the things that's happening in the government space right now is a pretty significant consideration about what kinds of controls you put around those types of activities. So whether it's the US government or Europe, thinking about restrictions from an export control standpoint or from just a due diligence standpoint on how you provide tools, that is actually something that gets at the same sets of concerns. So if you control the technology, for example, you restrict it from a legal standpoint, you're potentially affecting what tools could be used for hackback, right? So I think that it's important to sort of flesh out that space a little bit and understand that it doesn't have to be just the way it's framed in the Paris call, just a sort of general prohibition on hackback. There are other ways to control the set of activities that get at those same concerns and sort of fit in together. So that to me is something I think we can be a bit more nuanced in some ways than what you would see as just a sort of straight prohibition.
And I think maybe from my perspective, I think what would be helpful as well is we tried this to an extent a little bit on the panel where we're giving examples, but also a little bit in the paper that I referenced in the chat. But in trying to look at the examples of what concrete examples of what companies are doing that is on that spectrum, just to drive, we talked about capacity building, but drive understanding and awareness of what kind of activities are happening and why they're important and how they contribute to the safety and security of cyberspace or not, depending on where in the spectrum they are. But I think having those conversations with governments around the world, with civil society, and with industry, I think actually is a good way to go forward to try and sort of shed a little bit of light on sort of this murky space, because I think otherwise you really quickly go into just this should be banned, or I don't know, or this should be completely legal, which I think are the three answers, just because it is a difficult subject, and I think having concrete examples helps.
It's helpful, and I think you're right. The illustrative aspect of the discussion is something that's often lacking when we talk about it briefly, if it's 15 minutes on an hour-long panel on another topic. I know we're coming up on time, so I want to ask everybody in the room here sort of a final thought. What does the next 5 years of this debate look like? The frequency of botnet takedowns looks like it's going up. The complexity of those actions look like it's increasing. There's a more, the TrickBot takedown in particular, interesting for the number of different companies and government entities that are coordinating there, but certainly it's not alone. So thinking about the next 5 years of the hackback debate, where do you see some of the issues we've raised today, in particular thinking about intent and specific actions, these guardrails for behavior, where do you see those going? Why don't we start with Kaya, then go Alyssa, Ed, Steph?
So I think you're right. I think there will be, given that we see an increase, I would probably say in, actually no, we see, and we're more aware of the amount of criminal activity, in particular of what's going on online in this year. I'm not sure there's like a massive increase. It's just we are all online a lot more. But that doesn't mean that the actors are not becoming more sophisticated and more creative. So I think we will see on the defensive side, see the defenders get more sophisticated and creative, because we will have to be. And that will probably, that will hopefully mean that we will work together more. I think the last few examples of botnet takedowns that we were involved in clearly should demonstrate that there is an interest and a need from both governments and other private sector actors around the world in working together to address some of these challenges. But I think there will also be a pushing on this envelope more and more, just because I think defenders will be a little bit more desperate. Then I think this is why it's important that I think there are clear lines in the sand in terms of where we can go and where we should not go.
Yeah, and I'll be quick so we can move to everybody. But, I think one of the things that's happened is just having more conversation in this space. And so even the Paris call itself, at the notion that we have somewhat of agreed upon principles or structures, I think that will continue to grow. We're having discussions that we didn't have not that long ago. And so my hope is that we will actually expand those conversations and have somewhat more structures. And then I'll turn it over.
Sorry, I was muted. No, I think the only thing I would add is that possibly, in the same vein, like, let's ask our questions from is it Hackback, or should we be more, raise it to a higher level to be able to, what can we do going forward? And I anticipate we'll possibly, and fingers crossed, we get into this similar like what we did from counter narcotics back in the late 80s and 90s. We went and the Financial Action Task Force was created for anti-money laundering. And the idea to really utilizing something framework like that to be able to be much more collaborative and going after possibly the monetization of say, cyber criminal attacks, but also this notion of creating norms around even infrastructure registration, information sharing, some of that governance possibly that we can maybe raise a discussion so we don't have to talk about a particular hackback. What can we do at a higher level to go after other things that actually enable these types of attacks or groups as well?
Yeah, I agree. I see similar joint activity with legal entities to further gather information, using existing laws to protect. So, I think in the Microsoft case, there was some IP protections in there. I think things like that will continue to try to push existing laws in order to protect. And I think active defense will continue to shift. So that conversation will continue. And then in general, there are just concerns that the threats and the vulnerabilities are vast. The ecosystem is complex. This is asymmetrical, right? So keeping up, I think, is going to further the conversation over the next 5 years.
That's interesting. And I think particularly intriguing that, as we go through this, the notion that some of you, I think in a single company are going to own both the origin and the destination of a lot of these attacks. And so the private sector hackback question almost becomes an internal discussion rather than one for external norms. We've covered a lot of ground on what is already a pretty sizable debate. We've had some good questions. Thank you all for joining us. To the panelists, thank you for Microsoft for organizing, to the IGF for providing us this forum, and for everybody who's signed in this morning, this afternoon, and this evening. We appreciate you joining for a fun discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Trey, for moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you.